Sergio Oliva wins his second Mr. Olympia, and he's so good, nobody will even go up against him. All the details on the 1968 Mr. Olympia coming up next on Bodybuilding History.
I will be forever the myth.
You're the king of kings,
There's always a pecking order. The little packers never mess with the big packers. So I'm a rooster, and he's a chicken, so to speak.
Welcome to another edition of Bodybuilding History. I'm your host, John Hansen, and today I'm going to talk about the 1968 Mr. Olympia contest where Sergio Oliva won his second Mr. Olympia, and he won it unopposed. Nobody went up against him. Sergio was the only competitor in the 1968 Mr. Olympia. So the contest was held at the Brooklyn Academy of Music. This was the sixth year in a row that the IFBB held their world championships at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, and it was promoted by Bud Parker. The Mr. Olympia contest, of course, started in 1965. Larry Scott won the first two Mr. Olympias in 65 and 66, and then Sergio Oliva won his first Mr. Olympia in 1967. So Sergio was back to defend the title in 1968, and along with the Mr. Olympia contest, the IFBB also held the IFBB Mr. America and IFBB Mr. World contest on the same night. On previous years, they held the IFBB Mr. Universe contest along with all these other events, but on this year, the IFBB Mr. Universe was held in Miami Beach, and that was the historic event where Frank Zane beat Arnold Schwarzenegger in Arnold's very first IFBB event. But back to this contest. The contest started off with the IFBB Mr. America contest. It was held in three height classes, a short, medium, and tall class. The short class was again won by Rock Stonewall, who was from Chicago. This was the third year in a row that Rock won the short class at the IFBB Mr. America. Rock also won the Most Muscular Award in 1966 and 1967. In second place was Johnny Maldonado, a Puerto Rican bodybuilder from New York, who was a very good bodybuilder. Johnny also competed in that year's IFBB Mr. Universe contest in Miami, where he took third place. And in third place in the short class was Warren Frederick. Warren was a really thick, muscular bodybuilder who would go on to achieve some notoriety by competing in Dan Laurie's WBBG competitions. In fact, he won the WBBG Mr. International that same year after competing in this contest. All right, moving on to the medium class, Frank Zane was the winner at the medium class. This was Frank's third time competing in the IFBB Mr. America, and he had won the medium class the previous 2 years in 1966, where he lost out to Chet Yorton, and then in 1967, where he lost out to Don Howarth. But this year, Frank was successful. He took first place in the medium class again, and he went on to win the overall. And then, as I mentioned earlier, he also went on to win the IFBB Mr. Universe, where he beat Arnold. So this was a great year for Frank Zane. He wins the IFBB Mr. America and Mr. Universe all in the same year. And in 1965, Frank also competed in the Mr. Universe contest, which was held at the Brooklyn Academy of Music. And he also won his class there. And the overall that year was won by Earl Menard. Second place to Frank in the medium class was John DeCola. John was a really good bodybuilder, and he would go on to win the IFBB America the next year in 1969. And Pete Caputo, who was another good amateur bodybuilder, he was in third place in the medium class. Moving on to the tall class, Don Peters, who was a popular bodybuilder from California. He was featured a lot in Joe Weider's magazines. He wins the tall class, and Don also competed in the Mr. Universe contest that year in Miami. He took fourth place there. Richard Giofu, who was a good teenage bodybuilder, he was in second place to Don, and Richard won that year's IFBB Mr. North America contest, where he beat out both Leon Brown and Johnny Maldonado, so he was a good bodybuilder. And third place went to Robert Woods. And as they always did, they had body part awards at the Mr. America contest. This year, the most muscular man went to Zabel Kwazuski, who was another really famous bodybuilder from California. He was a good friend of Joe Gold. Zabel had great abs. He was an older bodybuilder, probably in his 40s at this time. So Zabel, I guess, competed in the short class that year, but he did not make the top three. But Zabel was good enough to win the most muscular award that year, beating out Rock Stonewall, who had won the most muscular award the last 2 years. Best chest went to Mike Katz, of course. Mike had that huge chest, and I guess Mike was in the tall class, but he also did not make the top 3, but he was good enough to win best chest. Rock Stonewall won best back on an award that he usually won. Best abs, of course, went to Zabel Kwaszewski. Zabel always won best abs. And Frank Zane won best legs. Frank usually won the best legs award because he had really good legs. And of course, the overall winner was Frank Zane, 1968 Mr. America. And then moving on, they had the IFBB Mr. World contest also. The Mr. World was a contest that the IFBB held to allow a lot of international bodybuilders to compete, especially bodybuilders from Latin American countries and Canada. They had 3 classes, a short, medium, and tall class. The short class went to Joe Nista. Joe was a popular bodybuilder at the time, sort of a short competitor, but very muscular and well-defined. Back in 1965, Joe had won the short class at the IFBB Mr. America contest. And then this year he wins a short class at the Mr. World. Elliot Gilchrist from Canada, another really good bodybuilder, another older bodybuilder in his 40s, he took 2nd place. And Elliot won his class at the 1966 IFBB Mr. World. So he was a really good international competitor as well. And Jose Donato Munez was in 3rd place in the short class. All right, the medium class went to the very popular bodybuilder Chuck Sipes, who was one of the superstars in the IFBB. Chuck won the IFBB Mr. America back in 1959, and he won the IFBB Mr. Universe in 1960. And Chuck was one of the competitors in both the 1966 and 1967 Mr. Olympia contest. So this was kind of a step down because Chuck went down from the Mr. Olympia to the Mr. World, but he ended up winning the medium class and the overall. Chuck had a real rugged physique. He was very thick, great abs, great forearms, and a real strong bodybuilder as well. This was a very convincing win for Chuck Sipes, who was a very accomplished bodybuilder at this point. 2nd place went to Roy Callender from Barbados. Roy was living in London at the time, and the year before, in 1967, he had competed in his first NABBA Mr. Universe, where he took 2nd place to Albert Beckles in the medium class. So Roy was a very thick, promising bodybuilder. Of course, he would go on and become an IFBB pro bodybuilder in the late 70s, and he was one of the top bodybuilders during that era. But at the time here, Roy took 2nd place to Chuck Sipes. And he also competed in the IFBB Mr. Universe that year in Miami. And he looked very, very good. I think he only got like 5th or 6th, but he should have placed much higher. He was really good bodybuilder. You could see at that time, Roy just had that real thick development, especially in his chest and back, good leg development, good arm development. So you could tell Roy was going to be a great bodybuilder in the future. 3rd place went to a bodybuilder who's not very well known, but he had a great physique. His name was Steve Burnett. And Steve would go on to compete in the IFBB in 1971, where he would win the medium class at the Mr. World contest. But at the time, in 1968, Steve had a really good physique, and he was in 3rd place. All right, moving on to the tall class. 1st place went to Conrad Laframboise, who was from Canada. Conrad won the 1965 overall Mr. Canada. And he also took 1st place in the medium class in the 1967 Mr. World. So he was a top competitor in the IFBB back in the 60s. Tony Carroll, who would go on to have a good career as a pro wrestler, he was in 2nd place in the tall class. And Christopher Ward was in 3rd place. And then just like the Mr. America, they had body part awards at the Mr. World contest. Chuck Sipes, showing his dominance in this event, really cleaned up on almost all the body part awards. Chuck won the most muscular award. Chuck also won best arms, best abs, and chest. Roy Callender won best back. And best legs went to a competitor from Japan, Nobuo Takemoto. He won the best legs award. And the overall, of course, went to Chuck Sipes. So this was a very convincing win for Chuck, one of the top bodybuilders in the IFBB. All right, now let's talk about the very controversial Mr. Olympia. And it was controversial that year because Sergio went in by himself. He was unopposed, and the crowd was absolutely blown away by Sergio. He was better than the year before. He was bigger. And at this time in the late 1960s, Sergio Oliva was very defined. he had a definition and quality to his physique that he would kind of lose a few years later in the 1970s when he became much bigger. But at this time in the late 1960s, Sergio was just unbelievable, really the best bodybuilder in the world by far, because he not only had those freaky proportions with the small waist, the huge upper body, the huge back, the huge chest, the unbelievably big arms, and fantastic legs. You got to remember, this is the 1960s. Not a lot of bodybuilders had great leg development back then, but Sergio had huge thighs and he had big calves, which was very unusual for a black bodybuilder. So Sergio was one of those rare bodybuilders who had everything, and he had that incredible structure with that tiny waist and hips. So he was really, really the most dominant and the best bodybuilder in the world at that time. And as I said, he had that quality physique where he had that hard definition, and he was very defined and just an unbelievable bodybuilder. But why did he win unopposed? Why were there no bodybuilders who were competing against him? Now, Harold Poole, who had taken second to Sergio the year before, and he had also taken second to Larry Scott in 1965 and 1966. Harold Poole was the runner-up at the Mr. Olympia 3 years in a row. What happened to Harold Poole? Well, according to an article I read in Muscle Builder magazine, Harold was working as a general manager at Cheetah's, which was a disco in New York. And he was so busy with his jobs as a manager. He had to hire people. He had to supervise the club every night, and obviously working very, very long hours. Harold's normal weight of 220 pounds, he dropped down to 205 pounds. So obviously Harold felt he was not ready to go up against Sergio and compete in Mr. Olympia. So he just sat out that year, which was a real shame because, as I said, Harold took second the last 3 years. So his presence was really missed. Now, I don't know why Chuck Sipes did not go in the Mr. Olympia, because Chuck had competed in the Mr. Olympia the last 2 years, in 1966 and 1967. In fact, in the year before, a lot of people felt it could have been very close between him and Sergio, but actually Chuck ended up in third place behind Harold Poole. So I don't know why Chuck did not compete in the Mr. Olympia that night after he just won the Mr. World, but Chuck also chose to sit it out. The other bodybuilder who everyone was expecting to see was Dave Draper. Now, Dave was one of the most popular bodybuilders competing in the IFBB at that time. Dave won the IFBB Mr. America contest in 1965, and then the next year, in 1966, he won the IFBB Mr. Universe. And then in 1967, he was in the Mr. Olympia, but he was kind of disappointing that year because Dave was doing a lot of television and movie work. Of course, he was in that movie Don't Make Waves with Tony Curtis and Sharon Tate. And he was doing the Beverly Hillbillies TV show. He was on the Monkees TV show. So he was very popular. He was doing a lot of commercials. And Dave said that was the reason why he was not in top shape in 1967. But he did not show up at all in 1968. I guess he was doing a lot of work for Joe Weider. He was doing a lot of promotional events where he had to travel around the country a lot. He was still probably busy with his film work and his television work. So Dave was another notable absentee at the 1968 Mr. Olympia. And people were also talking about Arnold Schwarzenegger showing up for the 1968 Mr. Olympia. Of course, Arnold had not competed in any IFBB shows at this time. He was a two-time Mr. Universe winner. He won the Mr. Universe in 1967 in the amateur event in NABA over in London. And then in 1968, he won his very first professional event at the NABA Universe. And he had not yet competed in any IFBB events, but he was still the talk of bodybuilding because he was only 21 years old. He was a two-time Mr. Universe winner, and he was being talked about in the Weider magazines. So a lot of people thought that Arnold Schwarzenegger was going to show up and compete in the 1968 Mr. Olympia, but he did not show up. He did not compete in any IFBB events until the Mr. Universe contest, which was held a few weeks later over in Miami Beach. And that, of course, he lost to Frank Zane. But Arnold would be back the next year in 1969 to compete in his first Mr. Olympia. So, as a result, Sergio Oliva wins his second Mr. Olympia contest unopposed. This only happened twice in the history of the Mr. Olympia. It happened in 1968, and it happened in 1971 when Arnold won unopposed, which we'll talk about on another episode. But in that contest, Arnold did have some competitors who did want to compete against him, but Weider suspended Sergio Oliva, so he was not allowed to compete. But in this contest, nobody showed up against Sergio, and he won the event unopposed, and he won his second Mr. Olympia contest, looking unbelievable. Now, a surprising thing happened after Sergio won the 1968 Mr. Olympia. After he was presented with the silver plate and the $1,000 prize by Joe Weider, Sergio asked for the microphone. And some people in the audience might have thought, oh no, what's Sergio going to do? Is he going to retire? Just like Larry Scott did after he won his second Mr. Olympia in 1966. So Sergio goes to the microphone and he starts to thank Joe Weider, who's standing right off stage. And he said it was Joe Weider's supplements that helped him win the Mr. Olympia title. Dan Laurie, who was a publisher for Muscle Training Illustrated, MTI, and he was a rival of Joe Weider's. And after Sergio said that it was Joe Weider's supplements that helped him build his body, Dan Laurie yelled out, "That's a lie." And the whole audience turned toward Dan Laurie to see what was going on. And Sergio told him to come up on stage. So Dan Laurie comes up and he's holding a copy of Muscle Training Illustrated. On the back cover of the magazine, there's a full-page picture of Sergio endorsing Laurie's weight gain supplement. And Dan Laurie yells out to the audience that Sergio Oliva won the 1967 Mr. Olympia because he used Dan Laurie's weight gain supplement. And Sergio starts arguing with him, saying that he didn't speak English and the whole thing was a misunderstanding and that he thought Dan Laurie's photographer was Weider's photographer. And he calls Dan Laurie a crook. He says, "I don't speak English, you're a crook." And this was a crazy mayhem on stage, right in the middle of the stage. And Joe Weider was just standing there smiling during the whole thing. And so this was a crazy ending to the 1968 Mr. Olympia where Sergio won his second title. So that's it for this episode of Bodybuilding History. Be sure to check out my podcast, Bodybuilding Legends Podcast, each week on Apple iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you hear your podcasts. And check out my website, bodybuildinglegendshow.com, for all my video and podcast interviews. We'll see you next time at the Bodybuilding Legends. This is John Hansen. Take care.